Hello, my name's Todd Bagshaw. I'm a parent at the school and I'm a member of the EAC, which is the Education Advisory Committee. We help with the school with supporting parents in interacting with the school and providing events like this where you can explore how different ways of working with your children can have different results. Today's event is the Balancing Act of Boundaries. We're really lucky to have Catie Dunlop, who's the school counsellor. Catie started as a teacher at this school. Actually, she started as a student at this school, has gone and done her teaching studies and was here as an English, global and drama teacher. She then did further study and has then 6 years ago become the school counsellor. So we're really lucky to have her to discuss the Balancing Act of Boundaries. In watching this, you may want to take a pen and paper and note down any questions that you may have. You may want to jot down your thoughts and pause the presentation at several spots at the start of the question. So if you're watching it with somebody else, you can discuss how things currently happen in your environment and how you think that that's working. And then you can listen to the section that Catie presents and pause and maybe have a conversation after at that. You also can email questions in. There's an email address on the screen, and you can email questions in that will be answered at a later date. Thank you. So, over to Catie. Thank you, Catie.
Great, thank you, Todd. So, to start with, I thought it'd be really important for us to have a little bit of a reflection of how 2020 has been for us so far, and specifically thinking about parenting and thinking about boundary setting. So, 2020 has been a year like no other, one that we obviously did not see coming. So, I'd like you to start maybe just to pause after these questions and really think about how it's been so far for you. Firstly, what has been your biggest joy in parenting at the moment? You might have been spending a little bit more time with your children, so that might be a little bit of a joy for some of you. And just think about how have dynamics changed in terms of boundary setting. Has it been easier during this or has it been harder? And that might lead on to what are some of the challenges that you've been experiencing so far during this year in terms of parenting, but also in boundary setting. So just start with that, because it's good to start with where you're at the moment before we move on to thinking about how we can be more conscious about our boundary setting for the future.
So, Catie, what is happening in my adolescent's brain? A few years ago, they were really sweet and communicative. Now, not so much.
Yeah, so this one's a really good question, because what's happening in our adolescent or emerging adolescent's brain at the moment has really big implications for how we actually parent them and for how we set boundaries. So if we are able to understand what's going on in the brain, we will have a better understanding of how we implement these boundaries, how we set them up, and how we connect with them and then redirect a behaviour when potentially they might break some of these boundaries. So if you were at my talk last year, for those parents who were in parents of grade 7 or 8 last year, and some of the older grades did come along as well, I spoke a little bit about the brain. So some of this might be a recap for some of you, and some of it might be completely new. So hopefully it's some good information for those of you that haven't heard any of this before. So the brain is massively changing during this time. In fact, at around the age of 11 and 12, the emerging adolescent is going through the biggest brain changes of their life. There are some big brain changes around the age of 2, but nothing quite as big as what's happening at age about 11 or 12, different for each individual, but around that time. So what's happening is that when they're children, the brain is like an expanding tree. So it's growing, it's spreading out its branches, and it's creating connections between the brain cells called neurons. And so as a child, we are learning, and we're like a sponge. We're basically taking every single bit of information and we are connecting the dots, and we are creating all these networks in our brain and creating this huge tree. So by the time they've got to about age 11 or 12, the brain needs to start doing a process called pruning. And what this means is that it's actually starting to prune away the parts of the brain that the neurons and the connections that you're not using anymore. So only those connections that are being used the most are retained, and everything else gets pruned away. And this is in order to create a more efficient adult brain. We cannot effectively become an adult if we're keeping the brain as as network, like as huge as it is.
We've spoken about this before, in that the brain change is like a very old city with lots of little alleyways and things, closing some of those down and using that land to make highways in. We've had that conversation.
Yeah, so it's a real process of refinement of the brain. It's a very important change that is happening. So we have to also at the same time remember a little bit more about the brain as well, and that the brain is also very changeable. So the neurons that fire together, wire together, meaning that the neurons that we are using and creating connections, and we keep firing it and firing it, they wire together and they create a really, really strong network, as we were saying. So this is really important because this is what we call neuroplasticity. We can change the brain by being conscious about the decisions that we make, and the experiences that we give our young people can be actually actively changing their brain at this time. So it's pruning away, but at the same time, we can be conscious about the experiencing they're getting to retain the neural connections that we'd like them to retain. So say, for example, they've been learning a language. If they all of a sudden drop that language off, then they're going to be pruning away those neurons that were being used for that function. But if we wanted them to continue to be able to use that, we would make sure that we were helping them develop those skills and keep firing those neurons so that they are wired together. So we know that the brain is changing, we know that it's changeable, and the last thing we need to know just briefly now is that it's very complex, the brain. Now, last presentation on the brain, I spoke about some of the work of Dr. Dan Siegel. Dr. Dan Siegel compares the brain to a house construction. So it's a house being built. When a baby is born, the downstairs brain, he says there's a downstairs and upstairs brain. It's a very basic way of thinking about it, but it's actually really clever. The downstairs brain is all about the building of, it's our primitive brain. It's the part that's responsible for our fight and flight tendencies, fight, flight, freeze. It's responsible for our huge emotions. It's responsible for sleeping, eating, all of the fundamental things for actually keeping us alive. So obviously, when we're born, our downstairs brain is really, really well developed because we are operating through our emotions and we are trying to get our needs met. All right. At the same time, so that part of our brain, the downstairs brain, is our amygdala and our hippocampus, and quite a few other parts of our brain too. But they're the main things that are really firing at that stage. Then later on, we've got what we call the upstairs brain. So it's the cerebral cortex, which goes over the top of your head here, and then it's the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for all our really high order thinking skills, our problem solving, our empathy, all of the really good things we want people to develop to become
impulse control, filters,
exactly,
all of those things, the bits that make you you.
Exactly. So that's our upstairs brain. So while our downstairs brain is really well established as a child, our upstairs brain isn't at all. So it takes a really long time for our upstairs brain to develop. In fact, scientists are now saying that your upstairs brain will not properly be developed until about the age of 27, and maybe a little bit longer for males. So this has huge implications for us when we're talking about boundaries, and I'll go on to talk about that a little bit more later. But we need to realise that this part of the brain, the part that is responsible for their decision-making skills and their impulse control, is not fully formed at all. And so some of the time they actually cannot behave in the way we'd like them to. And so this is where boundaries come in and become really important. You asked in your question about where's my sweet communicative child gone. At this age, they start to become a bit withdrawn. Not all of them. Every individual is different, but some of them become quite withdrawn and they actually turn to their peers more as their primary source of influence. Whereas in the past it's been their parents, now they're starting to turn towards their peers. So this has a big impact as well on their decision making and has an impact for you on boundaries as well, because a lot of the time, a lot of the decisions they're making with not a fully formed brain is around what their peers are doing and the influences that their peers are having. And they become withdrawn and they tend to want to talk to their peers instead. And when you ask them things, they might murmur or have not much of an answer to you as well at all, which can be quite frustrating. But because they're starting to turn towards their peers more than adults. Yeah.
Thanks, Catie. Catie, why is it so important to set boundaries in adolescent years?
Okay, so this is a really good question as well. So knowing just a little brief, tiny bit of information that I spoke to you about the brain, this is the implications that this has for setting boundaries is that because they don't have a fully formed upstairs brain, because they cannot make some of the decisions we'd like them to, or have their empathy skills or the impulse control, because their brain isn't developed, we need to act sometimes as their upstairs brain. That's incredibly important. We need to be able to show them how to think well and how to think smart. Because they do not have the capacity always to self-manage or problem solve or make responsible decisions. So boundaries are really important for that reason. But probably the most important reason for boundaries is that it shows young people that we care about them and that we care about their safety, and it makes them feel safe. They know what is expected of them. It makes them feel safe and supported. It helps them make more informed and sound decisions. Boundaries also provide them a framework for which they can have some independence as well. So boundaries are incredibly important. In fact, I'd like to argue that boundaries are perhaps one of the most loving things you can do for your child. I want to give an example. Here's a little bit of an analogy about why boundaries are so important. Todd, if you think about this year and when COVID-19 first hit, I don't know about you, and I'm not sure about everybody at home, but when it first hit, there was this real sense of impending doom because we could see what was happening out in other countries.
Supermarket shelves empty here locally and things as well.
And it was quite scary. It was quite anxiety-provoking for a lot of people because we'd never experienced a pandemic before. So we didn't know what was going on and we didn't know how to behave and we didn't know what we were allowed to do. And so I don't know about everybody else, but I felt a bit like, should I be doing this right now? What is okay? What is going to keep me safe? What is going to keep everybody I love safe? And so when the government came out and enforced some lockdown rules, I think these were some boundaries for everybody. These made, and I don't know about everybody else again, this made me feel a little bit safer. It made me think, okay, I know how I'm supposed to operate in this situation now. This is what I'm allowed to do and this is what I'm not allowed to do. And that made me feel safer. It made me feel like my government was caring about me and caring about the lives of everybody around me. And so it made me feel like I was able to have some independence within these boundaries. So although that's a very different example to what our teenagers go through, the example of that boundaries are important for those reasons, and that teenagers and emerging adolescents, they're experiencing things in their life that they've never experienced before, just like we are this pandemic we've never experienced before. So they're maybe having their first opportunity to go unaccompanied to the city or to Chermside, or they're going for their first ever party. They're doing things that are their first ever time. And if you don't have boundaries, it's scary. They might say, I don't want boundaries, I don't need boundaries, I hate them, why would you do this to me? But they're crying
unfair.
out for
it's
them.
So unfair.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure that's what a lot of parents have heard. Toddlers say that. My toddler says that all the time. So it's important that they're crying out for that. Just as when these lockdown laws were put in place, we didn't like them. I wasn't happy to be stuck at home with a newborn and a 3-year-old trying to entertain every single day. I was like, this is really hard. But it made me feel safe and it made me feel cared about, and we needed it.
In a framework so that it could work.
Exactly. So that's what our teenagers need. These boundaries are incredibly loving, incredibly kind, and exactly what you need to do for teenagers at this moment. So it's not a chance to say, oh, they're teenagers now, they can have a free rein. No, they need boundaries just as much as they did when they were toddlers.
Katie, I think it's a good example that we all have boundaries when we have a job, we have a time we have to turn up and what roles that we have to do, and they're within it and of itself boundaries within we're expected to operate. So letting adolescents have that understanding to start with as well as that they can develop within, I think is really helpful. Yeah,
definitely. So boundaries are fundamental to parenting, really. So I'd like to invite you at home now to just take a moment to pause and to think about, maybe have a real reflection actually. Often we parent because of the way we've parented. So think about the boundaries that were in place when you were a teenager. That might be a long time ago for some people and maybe not so much for others, but think about how you were parented and what boundaries were in place. Were you happy with those boundaries? Do you think your parents had enough boundaries? Do you think they were maybe a little bit relaxed? Were you craving more? Think about what boundaries you had as a reflection, because that will influence what you're doing when you parent your children. At the same time, while you've thought about that, think about your child now. As I said, you've been enforcing boundaries since they were really little. How do they respond to boundaries? Do they take it well? Are they one of those kids that doesn't really push back. Some teenagers are easier. Some teenagers don't push back. It's in their temperament. They really love it. Some of them, if they're on their more nervous sort of side, really, really want them and so don't push it back at all. And others like to really push them and like to be a real challenge. A lot of them do, and they might have times or different situations where they push. But so think about yourself and then think about your child and how your boundaries are going at the moment.
Thank you. So, Catie, how do I establish these boundaries without World War III?
Yes. Okay. So we'd like to avoid World War III, of course.
Thank you. I'd like to, yes.
That always makes it a much better experience if you can. So firstly, the first thing you should probably do is you need to sit down with your co-parent, or if you're a single parent, you need to sit down either by yourself or with some other caregiver of your child to really think about the boundaries. So it's really important to be conscious and deliberate in your formation of these boundaries. So sit down first and actually start to think about them. Think about what are the most important boundaries. What boundaries are negotiable and which ones are not. Which ones are, no, this has got to be it because it's a complete safety rule. What age do the boundaries change? Because obviously developmentally, you have to really target the age that they're at, and also you know your child better than anybody. Each child is different, each adolescent is different. So what age should they change and for what reasons? You need to really think about that. What will the boundaries actually be? You might want to enlist the help of your young person to help you really formulate these boundaries, particularly for the ones that are negotiable. And these are some of the things that you need to set boundaries on. So you'll see it on your screen here. Technology use. So you might need to start thinking about social media, time on devices, where they are stored, security settings.
That's been a really big thing with COVID going on with the schooling from home. And I know with my boys, there's a whole variety of devices that are essential for this, but sometimes not always essential.
Exactly. So technology use is going to be the biggest one at the moment, I think, for boundary setting. And if you haven't had many boundaries up until now, that's okay. You can always stop and actually just think about it now and start to really enforce some from now on if you'd like. So there's technology use. So you need to start thinking about that. We'll think about it right now. Socialisation time. Okay, this is another boundary setting time. When will they be able to see their friends, and how much freedom are they allowed to have when they socialise? When will they be allowed to go to Chermside by themselves? So some of you have got older kids and they've been doing that for years, and some of you haven't done that yet. So think deliberately about that. When are they going to be allowed to do that? Other things you might need to set boundaries on are parties, drinking, sleepovers, relationships, study, homework boundaries, paid work, helping around the house, chores. So there's a huge list of things that you can really sit down and start to actually flesh out. What are my boundaries and what are the reasonings behind this? Now, because we're presenting to any parent for the whole age group of the school, I am not going to give any specific boundaries here of telling you that at this age they should be doing this, because every individual is different. But if you do have any questions, if you want to know what is appropriate for this age, let me know. Send me an email and I can help you out with that and point you in the right direction for research on the most recent evidence of what ages are good and appropriate. So because it is good to have an understanding of what is appropriate for what age. So that's important. Sit down with somebody, talk about it, flesh out what your boundaries are going to be. So you might want to do that now. You might want to pause. You might want to go back and have a look at the list of the different things for boundaries and just think to yourself, what boundaries do I consciously enforce? Which ones do I actually know that I'm using and I'm using well? And which ones maybe do I need to flesh out a little bit more? You might not be at the age where they're asking to go to parties yet, but it doesn't mean you can't have a look now and start thinking about...
Start the conversation.
Yeah, how would I approach this? Just so that you're not caught off guard. You don't want to be trying to enforce boundaries when it's on the spur of the moment because they've asked you and you're not prepared. So you want to make sure that you're prepared for boundary setting. So you might want to pause right now and have a think about all of those boundaries. After that, you then need to think about pick a good moment to speak to your child about these boundaries. Okay, we want them to be receptive to this, not reactive to it. So when I presented about the brain last time, I spoke about the hand model of the brain. Have you heard about the hand model of the brain, Todd?
Yes, I have,
Yeah.
but you can explain it for the people because they probably haven't. So
this is another bit of genius from Dr. Dan Siegel. So the hand model of the brain is that we imagine that the brain is your hand. So this part here is what we call the reptilian brain, which is your downstairs brain, which is the primitive part of your brain, the amygdala, the hippocampus. So this is your fight,
brain
flight.
stem and the bottom of the brain, cerebellum.
Yep. So all of the downstairs part of the brain here in your hand. So this is your big emotions, fight, flight, and your day-to-day living, really. Over the top, your cerebral cortex and then your prefrontal cortex, and this is your higher order thinking. This is your upstairs brain. This is the part where, as I said, was the last part to develop. So when the brain is working well, the brain is working like this. Okay. When people, or particularly young people, when they have a meltdown or when they get upset about something, we call it flipping their lid, where they completely flip their upstairs brain. They flip it out the window and they're only operating on their fight flight. You see it in toddlers when they have a massive screaming meltdown and tantrum, and they are just, their downstairs brain is taken over and they have lost control. Teenagers do that too. They lose control because they don't have a fully formed upstairs brain yet. So they flip their lids and they're operating primarily on this pure emotion. And teenagers experience emotion very strongly. So if that happens for any reason, that is not the time to enforce boundaries or try to talk about the conversation about what boundaries are going to be set.
Because with the front part of the brain not activated, hearing and understanding and critical thinking aren't present.
Exactly. Okay, so in a minute I'm going to talk to everybody about how we actually do that. But picking a good moment is important for talking about boundaries. So if you're just having a fight and they're firing up and they've flipped their lid and they're just operating on their downstairs brain, it's not time to say, okay, we really need to discuss parameters around technology use right now, because they're not going to be receptive to it. They're only reactive. They're
activated.
Yeah. So pick your moments wisely. You don't have to do it straight away when something's bad's happened. You can take a breath, everyone take a breath, and pick your moment wisely to sit down and say, okay, our boundaries aren't working here, or it's time that we actually set up some boundaries here. When they are receptive to this, when they're using their upstairs brain, then that is the time when we can talk to them about boundaries. Because when they flip their lid, nothing's going to get through, nothing's going to get in.
Something Catie and I spoke about last year in one of the presentations was to be aware of that activation, and then that activation is contagious. So if you have a teenager that has flipped their lid in front of you, it's really easy to flip your lid as well, usually because that's contagious, and then somebody else that's present, they flip their lid too, and next thing everybody's going for it, and it's not a time for reason discussion. So
you have to wait till everybody's ready.
Yeah, take a deep breath.
Take a deep breath.
Step away from the child.
Exactly, because adults are able to flip their lid too. We do it. So definitely that's good.
And I have to own this. I can say nobody can push my buttons quite like your kids can sometimes.
No. Yes, I think that's very true for most people. So pick your moment right for your young person. So when you do sit down, you might want it to be, it depends on what your family dynamics are. Some families like to have a really formal sit down with the whole family, bring them in, and we're going to talk about boundaries. We're having a family meeting. That might work for your family. Others might like to have a bit more impromptu, that teenagers like, I don't know whether you found this with your boys, but teenagers like to talk a lot at night time. Maybe when they're getting into bed, suddenly they want to talk. Not all teenagers, but generally that might be when they're feeling the most comfortable to talk. So you might want to take that opportunity to say, look, I've been a little bit worried about this, or now you've asked about this, potentially we need to talk about some parameters or some boundaries around that. So when you talk about it, make sure you're using a friendly tone. Obviously, that's very helpful. Make sure you listen and respond to your child's concerns. They might think it's very, very unfair, and we need to validate that, because if we say to them, no, it's not unfair, you're not listening. We're not listening to them. We need to say, I know you think it's unfair. The power of just those words is amazing. You say, I know you think it's unfair. They're feeling heard. They're feeling validated. Okay, all right, yeah. And then you can tell them the reasoning why these boundaries are important. So you need to ensure that you reiterate that it's because of your care and concern for them that these boundaries are in place. You need to be very clear and precise so that there's no miscommunication, because they will be the first to be able to tell you later on, but hang on, you said this. You need to make sure that you're being very clear. Try to negotiate some points that you disagree on. We want to show them that if they're able to calmly and articulate things that they want to negotiate on, that we will listen to them. That we will say, okay, yeah, I can understand why that you think that would work, or why that's a better solution. And potentially you might want to take them up on that, because if they feel like they have a buy-in, they're able to actually help with the formulation of these. They're more receptive to actually living within these boundaries.
And sometimes if you're giving a little bit on some point, it then helps that they can then extend that a little bit further and then a little bit further, and if it's not working you can bring it back a little bit rather than starting with a lot as a step.
I know that the other counsellor, Sue, always uses this sneaky little trick for some of the boundary formulation, is to say that, say you want you want to make their children's bedtime, I don't know, 9:30. You can, in a cheeky little way, say, all right, I've decided that I think your bedtime should be 8:30. And they will not like that, obviously, and they'll say, no, 9. You can say, oh, okay, all right. And then they can say, or, they might say, oh, no, 9:30. So you've actually negotiated where you want it.
Yep.
And they've felt like they've had some input. It may not work forever. They'll probably see through that after a little while.
Yep. But not every decision, because otherwise every boundary is pushable.
Exactly, that's right. But just the ones that you can do, that you just let them feel like they're able to have some sort of, ownership over these.
Buy-in.
Yeah, exactly. So you also need to probably discuss what some of the consequences might be if these boundaries are pushed, just so that they know from the onset that you're going to follow through. You're going to firmly but gently and kindly follow through because you care about them. So making sure that we talk about those is important, and not just not having a discussion about the boundaries and then when something happens having to do it on the spur of the moment. I think that's really tricky. So making sure that you're really conscious and deliberate and make conscious choices about how you're going to talk to your children about it.
Rational too. You're grounded until you're 20.
Yes.
It's probably not going to
you can't follow through on that one, probably.
Yeah,
that's right. So the last thing in terms of enforcing these boundaries is that some parents might like to, after having a discussion, talk to their children about what boundaries they might want from you. So they feel like it's more of a team here. Maybe things around privacy. There are, when they're younger, obviously it's important that we monitor them incredibly closely, but as they get older, they might want some more freedom, and so they might say, look, I don't want you to read my messages anymore. Okay, you might have done that when they were much younger and they had a phone. So if they want to talk to you about some of their boundaries, you can say, yeah, that sounds like a good boundary too. Or the boundaries that you set, particularly maybe around technology use, you've got to make sure we're modelling it as well. Because if we say no phones at the table and then you sit there with your phone at the table, that's not really sending a good message about boundaries in terms of that everybody's a part of the team here. Yeah.
My stuff's more important than your stuff.
Exactly.
It's not a good answer.
Yeah.
Thank you, Catie. Catie, what are some practical strategies for when World War III does break out or my child does push out of the boundaries that we've negotiated?
Okay. So young people will test the boundaries. Not all of them, because as I said, some of them really are quite nervous and they like to have that and don't want to test any of the boundaries, but a lot of them will test the boundaries. So what they're doing is they are testing to see how much you really do mean it, how much you care about them, and that you are willing to follow through on what you've said. So there's another analogy, the roller coaster analogy, that when you get on a roller coaster, you get the harness over the top of you, it's your boundaries, it's constricting you, but most people give it a bit of a jiggle just to make sure it's going to hold you in, because obviously you don't want to fall. That's the same thing, that they're going to jiggle. They're going to try to make sure that they're testing these boundaries to make sure that, to see what they can get away with.
It is really there.
Yeah, that's right. So that's perfectly normal. And it doesn't mean that so no matter how good your relationship is with your child, they might still try to break the boundaries. That's because they have impulsive behaviour, because that part of their brain isn't fully developed. They might have the influence of their peers. At this age, as I said, because they're so influenced by their peers, and part of the brain that actually helps them cope when they're excluded by their peers isn't fully developed like it is in adults. Adults can do a lot more and be judged a lot more by others and cope with it a bit better than adolescents. Adolescents find it very, very difficult to be not part of the crowd and to not be to not fit in, or it's an evolutionary thing as well. So because of that, they want to be doing what their peers are doing, or they want to be pushing the boundaries, and if some child's doing something else, or they're going to try and push that and try to fit in and do the same things that their friends are doing. So all of those reasons might mean that they are going to push the boundaries. So the first thing you need to do as a parent, if there's a meltdown or they've broken a boundary, is that you need to ask yourself, why did my child behave like this? Because there is usually a reason. And it's not because they want to torment you, that they're the naughtiest child in the world. It's not generally that. It's mostly because they might be connection seeking, or they might be thrill seeking. Adolescents, I know that you spoke about this last time we presented, have this real desire to risk take and to have the thrill seeking due to different chemicals and hormones that are produced in the brain and the body. So ask yourself, why did they behave like this? Was it one of those reasons? What need were they trying to meet when they did it? And what do I want to teach them in this moment? And how best can I teach it? So if you remember my last presentation, for those of you that were there, I spoke about discipline being not about punishment, but discipline is about teaching. How can we best teach our children, not punish them? If we want to try to help them to develop into the most responsible adults, we do it through teaching them, not through punishing them. So we think about, how do we teach them? Okay, and we think about all those questions. Then the first thing that we do in basically any situation of parenting when there's a meltdown or a crisis is that we connect with them first. Connection is always the key. So because they flip their lid is generally what's happened in a meltdown, or they've broken the rules and you try to talk to them about it and they might arc up. Connection is what's going to help integrate the brain. Connection is what's going to calm the downstairs brain, and it's going to help them to use their upstairs brain to think about what they've done, to think about how they can make things right. So firstly, we want to connect with them. Absolutely, the first thing. So to do that, to connect with our young people, we need to communicate comfort for them first. There's a cycle of connection. The first one is to communicate comfort. So even if you're really angry at them and you really didn't like what they're doing, okay, we stop, we get down on their level, we communicate some comfort to them. It might mean that we, touch them or just get down and are not a threat to them, because the moment that we present ourselves as a threat, that's going to fire their downstairs brain, and they're not going to want to engage in any meaningful discussion because they're seeing you as a threat and you're above them and you're yelling.
Something to oppose.
Exactly, that's right. So communicate comfort. We're not saying that we like or love their behaviour, but we're just trying to calm their downstairs brain so that we can teach them how to behave better, how to think about their actions, or how to just think about these boundaries in a more rational way. So communicate comfort, validate their feelings. They might be feeling frustrated, angry, sad. There might be all of these feelings that are coming out. Validate that. Okay, I can see that you're feeling really sad at the moment. I can see you feeling really frustrated, or you might be feeling a little bit guilty or a little bit ashamed about what's happened here. Validate, okay, this is how you're feeling. I notice that. Listen to what they've got to say and reflect back what they've got to say. All of this is calming the downstairs brain and integrating it, creating the connections that we need in their brain. It's strengthening your relationship. This connection strengthens your relationship always. And it gives you time and space to think about how you want to respond as well. Once we've got them to calm down and we've connected with them first, then, and only then, we can then move on to redirect their behaviour. Okay, so they've broken the rules, they've had a big meltdown when you try to talk to them about it. Firstly, connect with them, integrate their brain, help them calm down, and then, and only then, when everybody's calm, we can say, okay, it's time to redirect your behaviour now. They may not be straight away. We do not have to, straight away, something's happened, we have to quickly enforce it, this is your consequences, do this and this, because you're just going to be poking the lizard, which is the primitive brain, and they're going to fire up again. You can connect with them, say, okay, we're going to talk about this in a minute, or we're going to talk about this tonight, we're going to talk about this later, and we will talk about how we're going to make this right now, right again. So wait for them to be ready. Then, once they're ready, this is when we redirect their behaviour. We're teaching them about their past behaviour and then how they can improve their behaviour. Or we're talking through the boundaries that we've put in place. So identify their behaviour. What actually what did they do that wasn't what you wanted or was flouting the boundaries? And get them to talk about what consequences potentially might have to happen now. You might have already agreed to those beforehand, or you might have to think of them now. Okay, what are we going to do to make this right? Maybe there's going to be some natural consequences that come about some of the decision making. They might be in trouble at school for something that they've done, and that's a natural consequence because they've
get followed through by the school because you're doing consistency, otherwise you get aberrant behaviour.
That's right. So say it's a technology policy. We have a wonderful technology policy here at Hillbrook, so potentially they've broken some of those boundaries and they will be followed through on that as well. So there's a natural consequence here at school. And then you might think about, well, what additional, will we be doing anything at home? That doesn't have to be necessarily, but they can be. And what is that going to entail? Now, parenting expert Maggie Dent, have you heard of Maggie Dent before?
I've heard you speak of her before, yes.
Yeah, she's particularly talks about boys, but she's a parenting expert of all. She talks about enforcing consequences that aren't too big. So you made that joke before about saying you're
grounded until you're 30 or 20,
like
yes.
That. Obviously, that's not going to be an appropriate consequence. So it should be more about keeping the consequences mild. It's very easy to get really angry and say, that's it, no internet for the rest of the term. And then you think, oh no, how are they going to do their work? I've said this now. And you've got to do lots of backtrack.
I can't follow that through.
Yeah. So Maggie Dent says that for around this age group, particularly tweens, it's your emerging adolescents, it's good to say that on the first occasion, your privileges will be revoked for 24 hours. Second occasion, 48 hours. Third occasion, 24 hours added each time.
Yep.
So it's more of a manageable thing. If we're going the whole term straight away, well, if it happens again, what are we going to do next?
Yep.
So manageable consequences, because it's not about punishment. The punishment isn't what teaches them. It's the redirection that teaches them. It's the integration of the brain. It's trying to actually get them to think about their actions that's going to teach them. The punishment might make them feel resentful if it's for too long and actually not give you the desired outcome. It can be 24 hours, all right, you're off, and then we'll start again. And done in a non-judgmental way. Our kids are going to stuff up. They're going to make mistakes. Non-judgmentally, okay, you've broken the rules. Right, this is what's going to happen. And they can be part of that. All right, this is how I'm going to make it right now. This is how I'm going to make it better. So we then have to follow through with that. Have to always follow through. Okay. If you don't follow through, then your young people are going to realise that, well,
why
these
should
boundaries
they listen?
are here.
There's no consequence.
Exactly. And these boundaries in place, but they don't care enough to follow through with it. And unfortunately, it's going to be hard because sometimes when you enforce those consequences, you're going to flip their lid again and they're going to have a massive meltdown. You've got to allow that emotion. They can be upset about it. They can be angry about it. They can deal with those emotions. Mm-hmm. They will be okay.
But own it. You did it. This is the consequence.
Exactly.
Here we are.
Yeah, that's right. So also provide some positive reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is really invaluable. Psychologists say that whenever we interact with our kids, 80% of the time it should be a really positive reinforcement, like an 80-20 rule. If it could be more than that, if it's 90-10 or 99-1 would be wonderful, but making sure that we are picking up when they are adhering to our boundaries. Thank you for doing that is a really good one. Thank you for making sure you were home on time. Picking up on those positives is really important because it does wonders for our young people to know that you're noticing.
Highlights our reward centres in our brain, which help wire our brain as well.
It does, yeah. So making sure positive reinforcement is used a lot is really important. So the process of this boundary setting will be ongoing throughout the whole adolescence. You will have to tweak it all of the time, depending on what's happened in their age groups, and new things will come up. So it's not just something that you can just be one size fits all. That's it. Done my boundary setting. I can move on now. No, we have to keep developing it as time goes on. Obviously, a lot of this is really self-explanatory, and I'm sure you're all doing a wonderful job anyway. But it's good to sometimes just hear it out loud again and have a real conscious thought about it.
I think it's really good to think about it, and I know in our situation it was really useful to stop and take stock and compare notes at various points, just so that it was a considered action rather than just reacting. That's right. So to sum up with that, if they're having a meltdown, they've broken a rule, connect. Always connect with our young people. It's not saying that I like or love how you've behaved. You're saying I love you and I'm going to be here for you and I'm going to connect with you and help you with your brain formation now. We're building your brain. I'm going to help you see
how what you did wasn't right and how you can make it better. So connection always first, and then you can redirect their behaviour.
Yeah, accept the person but not the behaviour.
Exactly. That's right. Yeah. So I think that's the biggest tips for when that happens. If you have any more questions around that, because it is tricky,
Please email in.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So, Catie, what are some top tips for right now?
Okay. I would love to be able to tell you exactly what to do in every situation.
Please.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I can't. So that's about doing your own research and knowing your own child so that you can make the best, most informed decisions around your boundary setting. But here are some of my top tips around this age group. Number one, make sure that you give them opportunities to have some healthy risk-taking. So sometimes the reasons why they are breaking the boundaries is because they are seeking this risk-taking behaviour. They're wanting this thrill. So they can get that in healthy ways. Okay, it may not seem like it's the same sort of thing, but you can get it by doing sports. You can get it by travelling. Unfortunately, we can't travel at the moment, but when they're older and they get to have a bit more freedom in travelling, that, especially our outdoor ed program, those sort of things are really important for healthy risks. It could be some paid work that they're doing. That's a bit of risk taking. They've got to put themselves out and they've got to talk to customers. Risk taking is anything that involves a possibility of failure. So it could be a drama performance, something that puts themselves on the line and gives them that same rush of the hormones and the things that they're sort of seeking as an adolescent.
Yeah, when it works, it's fantastic.
Exactly. So enable some healthy risk-taking so that they feel like they're getting their needs met in that way, and they're not going to be, therefore, unlikely to go down the path of some of the more unhealthy risk-taking because they haven't got what they need through the other ways. Next, be a positive role model. I spoke about this before, making sure that we are... if we are setting up boundaries around technology, that you're doing that for yourself as well at home is really helpful for our young people. Be consistent, but not rigid. We want to be consistent, we want to follow through, but it's okay to change our ideas and to tweak things and to not have to hold things so tightly that we cannot change it no matter what happens.
We're going to have to release boundaries at some point when they stop being adolescents and become young adults.
Exactly. And it is scary for parents. It is scary because you want them to be safe at all costs. And it would be very easy to say, right, that's it, no parties. You're never going to party while you're at school. Actually, that probably wouldn't be that easy because they would be really upset about that. But or some of them might be relieved. Yeah. But at some age, it is going to get to the stage where it is appropriate for them to go to parties. But the boundaries change where you can then start to talk about, well, okay, you can go to this party, but here are your boundaries. You need to be home at this time. I'm going to call the parents and check that they are home and there's adult supervision. I'm going to be making sure this is happening and this is happening. So you are actually, you're saying yes to the party, but your boundaries are about how that party is going to work for your child. So that's where you're being consistent but not rigid. Talk to other parents. This is really important, to talk to other parents and find out what are their boundaries around things. Most of the time, you find that they have the same ones. But your young person, your teenager will say, nobody else's parents is making them do this.
I am so hard done by.
Exactly.
Yes.
How could you do this to me? Everyone else gets to do this. No, they don't. Everybody else's parents are probably trying to enforce the same boundaries. So if there's an opportunity for you to get together with people from your home class, other parents from the home class or the year, hopefully there'll be some more opportunities next year when we can actually get together.
Out to see each other.
Yeah. Talking about that, we're talking about what boundaries for technology, what for parties, what is age appropriate would be really helpful, because then you can say to your young person, yeah, no, I know because I've spoken to this parent and they're doing that with their child. So we are all on the same page.
The EAC actually hosts several events through the year where we've done this via Zoom, to have parents talk to each other from different classes or different areas to discuss people's reaction to COVID or what people do for disciplines or for parties. And I think the EAC is actually having a police officer later in the year. I think that's going ahead, come along, that we've had before. He's a very interesting fellow to talk about your responsibilities with parties and alcohol and who you're allowed to be a responsible adult for, and about some of the boundaries that are imposed by the law and by the situations that as parents you might get yourself in.
Yeah, that's a good point, because obviously some of the boundaries are enforced by law.
Yes.
So that's an easy one to say, well, this is the law. This is what we have to follow. So that's important. When our young people are behaving at their worst, it's when they need us the most. So it's very easy to say, you go to your room and you just deal with it yourself. But that's actually when they need us. They absolutely need us to help them through because their brain isn't firing the way that they
Put the lid back on.
Exactly. So they need us, and they need you to be their parent, not their friend, for boundaries. Because friends would let them do whatever they wanted because you want to make your friend happy all the time. But it's not our job to make our kids happy all the time. We'd like them to be, but that's not life, unfortunately. We want them to be safe. So we want to make sure we're being their parent and being there for them when they need it. Another little tip as well is to make sure that this is a little one when having an argument with them, just let them have the last word. Because teenagers want two things in an argument. They want to either have the last word or they want to be the loudest. And we don't need to have either of those things, really. If that makes them feel like they have some sort of control, then let them have it. Because otherwise, if you're trying to have the last word, your conversation's going to go on for a very long time.
It's probably going to get snappy.
It is. So as long as you've said what you need to say, leave it at that. Let them have their last word and to rant and rave. And maybe don't ignore them, validate that, but let them have their last word, and that's okay. They can have that. It doesn't mean your boundaries are going to change. It doesn't mean they won because they got the last word. It just lets them feel like they've had some sort of victory, even though they probably haven't. That's just a little tip. Let them have the last word. If they're going to get really, really loud, don't you match their loudness for their loudness, even though it's very tempting. They're allowed to be angry. So that's my next point, is allow their emotions. They're allowed to be angry about things. That's a normal human emotion.
Yes.
Their behaviour, they can't punch a wall.
Yep.
They can't, bully or harass or hurt
You're
anybody.
allowed to have the motion, but how you express that in your behaviour is what we're talking about.
Exactly. So if they're angry, they're angry. You can say, I can see you're really angry by this. I hear you. Okay, I would have been angry if I was you at your age too. Okay, but this is the reason why I'm doing it. And they will understand. I don't know about you, but there's some things that I look back at my parents now and say, thank God you had that rule. I'm so glad you did. I hated it at the time, but I'm glad you did because it made it much easier for me in the long run.
Some of the decisions I know, I can personalise that. I've reflected since being a parent at some of the decisions my parents made and nod quietly and sagely sometimes, yes. Yes,
exactly. That's right. So allow these emotions. Okay, and I've only got a few little other tips. Apologise when you get it wrong. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we will get it wrong. Sometimes we'll go, oh, maybe that boundary was a bit firm. We can sit down and say, actually, you know what, that might have been a bit firm. That's okay. Yep. It's okay to apologise. In fact, you're showing them that we are all still learning. If we show them that we're all still learning, everybody, it can help try to curb that perfectionistic tendency. If they think that you have everything, you know everything right, then they're going to be aiming for that as well in their life. But if you just say, you know what, sometimes we make mistakes, particularly for our first children. I kind of feel sorry for firstborns because they have really strong boundaries.
Trailblazers.
Yeah, they have really strong boundaries. So sometimes we might want to sit back to the first one and say, yeah, I know, I'm sorry. That might have seemed really harsh. I know what we're doing with your siblings is a lot softer. I'm sorry about that.
Yep.
Okay, we can apologise.
Here we are.
Yeah. Acknowledge their strengths. They have a lot of strengths, our young people. Adolescents have a lot of great things. Sometimes it's really easy to be like, oh, they're not doing this, and have fear-based parenting. Sit down. You might even want to pause right now and quickly brainstorm. What are the strengths of your young person right now? What makes them so amazing? Because they are. And keep thinking about that. Every time they break a boundary, be like, well, look at all the great stuff that they're also really good at. That's important. Pick your battles. Find somewhere to compromise. Keep your consequences mild. Try not to overreact when they've done something. We want to be non-judgmental, okay? They've stuffed up, don't want to overreact. Often in my counselling room, I have young people who say, I can't tell my parents they're going to overreact. They're going to go crazy. They're going to be really unhappy with me. We want to just be calm and say, okay, this is what's happened, even though inside you're like, oh my goodness, why could you do that?
Use our front brain.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah. We want to just calmly not overreact, okay? And my last point of all is let life be their teacher as well, okay? Let them make mistakes. They might go out and stuff things up and life will teach them how to also, obviously in a safe way, what is appropriate
within
and what
the
isn't.
Boundaries.
Within the boundaries. Yeah. So if you have any questions, make sure you definitely let me know and I will, answer them as much as I can.
Outstanding, Catie. Thank you very much. Really appreciate your speaking here today. And if you would like to know more, keep an eye out on the school newsletter. There is EAC events scattered, usually one a term. I know we got caught up with COVID and lots of things got stopped everywhere, but we were just a part of that. And if you would like to be involved with the EAC, keep an eye out on the school newsletter because it gives the times when the meetings are on. It's in the first week of every term. Thank you very much.
Thanks.